Picture a courtroom in 1895. Oscar Wilde stands in the dock at the Old Bailey, London, impeccably dressed, his wit already famous across 2 continents. He has written some of the most celebrated plays in the English language. He has dined with lords and laughed with princes. And now he is being destroyed, publicly, methodically, and with the full machinery of the British state, for what the prosecution calls the love that dare not speak its name. The judge sentences him to 2 years of hard labor. The crowd outside cheers, and somewhere in the galleries, reporters scribble furiously, because this moment, this precise, theatrical, devastating moment, will be remembered as proof of something. Proof that this is how it has always been. That disapproval, criminalization, and shame are the ancient, natural, universal response to same-sex love. That history has always stood on one side of this question. That is the story most people were taught. Here is what the historical record actually shows. The idea that same-sex love and gender variance were universally condemned throughout human history is not an ancient truth. It is a surprisingly recent invention. One with a specific origin, specific architects, and specific beneficiaries. And when you follow the evidence back through the centuries, what you find is not a straight line of condemnation, stretching from antiquity to the present. What you find is something far stranger, far more complicated, and far more interesting than that. You find cultures that celebrated what others condemned. You find centuries of silence that got mistaken for centuries of absence. You find a word, a single word, that was invented in 1869 and quietly rewrote how an entire civilization understood itself. And you find that Oscar Wilde, standing in that dock, was not the latest chapter in an eternal story. He was one of the first victims of a very modern one. Let's go back to the beginning. Not the beginning of same-sex love, that is as old as the human species, but the beginning of the story we were told about it. For most of Western history, the dominant framework for understanding sexuality was not identity but act. The ancient Greeks did not have a concept of homosexuality as a fixed category of person. This is not a fringe academic position. It is the consensus of classical scholars, including Sir Kenneth Dover, whose landmark 978 Study Greek Homosexuality remains one of the foundational texts in the field. What the Greeks had was an elaborate set of social codes governing who could desire whom, under what circumstances, and in what role. Male same-sex relationships, particularly between an older man and a younger one in the pedagogical tradition known as pederasty, were not merely tolerated in many city-states, they were idealized. Plato's Symposium, one of the most celebrated philosophical texts in human history, is structured around a dinner party where a series of speakers compete to deliver the most beautiful speech in praise of Eros. And several of those speeches explicitly celebrate love between men. Socrates himself, in that text, describes his education in the philosophy of love as having been guided by a woman named Diotima, but the love being philosophized about moves fluidly across what we would now call categories. This is the love that dare not speak its name. And in Athens in 400 BCE, it was speaking extremely loudly. Rome inherited much of this framework and bent it in its own direction. Roman sexuality was organized around power and social status rather than the gender of one's partner. A Roman citizen of high standing could, without social censure, have sex with men, women, or enslaved people of either gender, provided he was always in the dominant, active role. Passivity was what carried stigma, not same-sex desire itself. The Emperor Hadrian, one of the most capable administrators in Roman imperial history, maintained a famously passionate relationship with a young Greek man named Antinous. When Antinous drowned in the Nile in 130 CE, Hadrian's grief was so profound and so publicly expressed that he founded a city in Antinous' name, Antinopolis, declared him a god, and commissioned hundreds of statues of him that were distributed across the empire. Those statues still survive. You can see them in museums across Europe. Hadrian did not hide this relationship. He monumentalized it, in stone, across an empire. This is the love that dare not speak its name. And one of the most powerful men in the ancient world spent years and enormous imperial resources making sure everyone heard it. Moving east, the picture becomes even more varied. In pre-Tang and Tang Dynasty China, historical and literary sources document what scholars call the Passion of the Cut Sleeve, a term derived from a story about the Han Emperor Ai, who reportedly cut off his sleeve rather than wake his male companion Dong Xian, who had fallen asleep on it. The phrase became a literary shorthand for male same-sex love, and it appears across centuries of Chinese poetry, fiction, and historical record. The Ming Dynasty novel, Bian Chai, features same-sex relationships as central plot elements. The Qing Dynasty saw the production of extensive erotic literature depicting male love. None of this was secret. None of it required euphemism within its own cultural context. It was simply part of the texture of human experience, recorded and sometimes celebrated. In feudal Japan, same-sex love between men, particularly within Buddhist monasteries and among the samurai class, had its own name, its own literature, and its own aesthetic tradition. Nanshoku, sometimes translated as male love, was documented in texts dating back to at least the 10th century. The celebrated writer Ihara Saikaku wrote an entire volume in 1687 titled The Great Mirror of Male Love, a collection of 40 stories depicting relationships between samurai and their younger male companions. This was not underground literature. It was published. It was read. It was part of mainstream literary culture. And in pre-colonial indigenous cultures across the Americas, Africa, and the Pacific, there existed what anthropologists and historians now describe using the umbrella term two-spirit. Individuals who occupied gender and social roles that did not conform to a strict male-female binary. This is not a modern reinterpretation of ambiguous historical evidence. European explorers and missionaries documented these individuals in their own journals and letters, from the earliest periods of contact, frequently expressing horror and incomprehension, which tells us something important. They were seeing something real, something established, something that the communities in question understood and accommodated, and the Europeans were the ones who found it strange. The Zuni of the American Southwest, the Navajo, the Lakota, the Crow, across dozens of distinct cultures and languages, there were recognized social roles for people who did not fit neatly into binary categories. These were not marginal figures. In many communities, they held spiritual authority. So how did we get from Hadrian's grief monuments to Oscar Wilde's prison sentence? How did we get from the great mirror of male love to the criminalization that greeted the 20th century? The answer runs through a single institution, a single theological tradition, and eventually one extraordinary linguistic event. The institution is the Christian Church, and specifically the transformation of Roman law under the Emperor Justinian in the 6th century CE. Justinian's legal reforms, compiled in what became known as the Corpus Juris Civilis, represented a massive codification of Roman law, but one increasingly shaped by Christian theological priorities. Justinian issued two specific edicts in 538 and 544 CE that explicitly condemned same-sex acts as causes of divine punishment, citing the destruction of Sodom as precedent. This was genuinely new. It was not the continuation of a timeless, universal condemnation. It was a specific legal and theological decision made by a specific emperor at a specific moment for reasons that had as much to do with political consolidation and religious authority as with morality. The historian John Boswell, in his controversial but enormously influential 980 Study Christianity, Social Tolerance and Homosexuality, argued that early Christianity was far more ambiguous on this question than later tradition claimed, and that the hardening of condemnation was a gradual political process, not a theological given. Boswell's work has been debated and refined by subsequent scholars, but the core observation stands. The severity and universality of condemnation increased over time, and that increase had historical causes. This is the love that dare not speak its name. But for most of the medieval period, the name it could not speak had not even been invented yet. This brings us to 1869, and to a man named Karl-Maria Kurt Benny. Kurt Benny was an Austro-Hungarian journalist and human rights campaigner, and he was trying to argue against a Prussian law that criminalized what we would now call same-sex acts between men. In a private letter written in 1868, and then in a published pamphlet in 1869-60, he coined two new words, heterosexual and homosexual. He invented these terms specifically as a rhetorical strategy. His argument was that if same-sex attraction was a fixed, innate characteristic of certain people, rather than a sinful choice that anyone might make, then it was unjust to criminalize it. He was trying to help. His intentions were, by any reasonable measure, good. But the words he created did something that no words had quite done before. They created a category of person, not just a category of act. Before Kirkbenny, you might be accused of committing sodomy. After Kirkbenny, you could be identified, and identify yourself as a homosexual. This seems like a subtle distinction. It was not. It was one of the most consequential shifts in the history of how human beings understand themselves. Because once you have a category of person, you can study that person. You can diagnose that person. And in the late 19th century, that is exactly what happened. The new discipline of psychiatry, itself barely a generation old, seized on Kirkbenny's terminology and filled it with pathology. Richard von Krafft-Ebing published Psychopathia Sexualis in 1886, cataloging what he called sexual perversions, with the clinical detachment of a naturalist pinning beetles. Sigmund Freud followed, with theories of arrested development and inversion. The language of sin, which at least acknowledged moral agency, was quietly replaced by the language of illness, which did not. You could repent a sin. You could not repent a diagnosis. And so the same-sex love that had been idealized in Athens, monumentalized in Rome, celebrated in Ming Dynasty fiction, and woven into the warrior culture of feudal Japan, was now, in the progressive, scientific, enlightened West of the 19th and 20th centuries, a mental disorder. Oscar Wilde walked into that world. He was tried under the Criminal Law Amendment Act of 1885, a law so new that the ink was barely dry. This was not ancient condemnation catching up with him. It was brand new condemnation, freshly manufactured. The men who prosecuted him were not enforcing a timeless tradition. They were enforcing a law that was 2 years younger than some of his plays. The myth of eternal condemnation serves a purpose, of course. Myths always do. If same-sex love has always been condemned by all cultures in all times, then condemnation feels like a natural law rather than a historical choice. It feels like gravity rather than policy. It removes the question of human agency, of who decided and why and who benefited. But the historical record will not cooperate with that narrative, no matter how forcefully it is asserted. The record is too rich, too varied, too stubbornly documented. Consider medieval Europe itself, supposedly the dark heart of universal condemnation. Boswell documented same-sex unions being blessed in Christian churches as late as the 13th and 14th centuries, in ceremonies he called adelphopoiesis, or brother-making. These were not secret ceremonies. They were performed by clergy, in churches, with witnesses. Whether they constituted what we would call marriage is debated. Scholars like Robin Darling Young have challenged Boswell's interpretation of what these ceremonies meant. But their existence is not disputed. Something was being formalized. Something was being recognized. The picture is not one of monolithic rejection. And then there is the Renaissance, which any honest survey of art history will confirm was not exactly a period of rigorous enforcement. Michelangelo wrote love sonnets to men. Leonardo da Vinci was twice charged with sodomy in Florence. The charges eventually dropped. Christopher Marlowe, who gave English drama some of its most magnificent early lines, was reported by an informer to have said that all they that love not tobacco and boys are fools. Whether or not he said it, it tells us something about the world he moved in. The Florentine court of Lorenzo de' Medici, the papal courts of Rome, the courts of Henry III of France. These were not environments in which same-sex desire was invisible or uniformly suppressed. They were environments in which it operated according to complex, contextual, often hypocritical rules that had less to do with timeless morality than with class, power, and discretion. None of this is to romanticize the past or pretend that persecution did not happen. It did. Horribly and often. People were burned, people were hanged, people were tortured and imprisoned for whom they loved, across many cultures and many centuries. The suffering was real, and the historical record documents it with brutal clarity. But persecution and universal condemnation are not the same thing. And the existence of persecution in some times and places does not prove the myth of eternal. Universal rejection, especially when the same record that documents persecution also documents celebration, accommodation, and love. The deeper myth, the one beneath the myth, is the myth of Western historical continuity. The idea that the values of Victorian England, dressed up in the language of natural law and divine mandate, represent the culmination of all human moral wisdom across all cultures and all centuries. That what a Prussian law of 1871 declared criminal reflects what Athens in 450 BCE understood to be true, and what Hadrian felt when he founded a city for his dead beloved, and what the Zuni understood about the people in their communities who walked between genders. The historical record does not support this. The historical record actively contradicts it. What it supports instead is something more honest and more uncomfortable, that human societies have always varied enormously in how they understand, organize, and regulate desire and gender. That the categories we use, homosexual, heterosexual, even the binary of male and female as fixed, absolute, exhaustive categories, are not timeless natural facts, but historical constructions, invented at particular moments by particular people for particular reasons. That Kurt Benny sat down in 1869 and wrote 2 words that would reshape how hundreds of millions of people understood themselves. That Justinian issued edicts in the 6th century that would echo through Western law for over 1,000 years. That the ancient tradition of universal condemnation is, in the scope of human history, strikingly young. There is one more figure worth naming here, because her story captures the absurdity of the myth with particular precision. Sappho of Lesbos lived in the 7th century BCE. She ran what appears to have been a school or community for young women on the Greek island of Lesbos. And she wrote poetry, some of the most technically accomplished lyric poetry in the ancient world, much of it expressing passionate love for women. Her work was celebrated across the ancient world. Plato called her the 10th muse. She was included in lists of the greatest Greek poets alongside Pindar and Alcaeus. Her island's name and her own name became, in the 19th and 20th centuries, the etymological source of 2 English words for female same-sex love. She did not know she was doing something transgressive, because in her world, she was not. She was a celebrated poet, running a celebrated school, writing celebrated poetry about love. The transgression was not hers. It was invented later by people who needed her to have been hiding. This is the love that dare not speak its name. It had been speaking for 25 centuries before anyone tried to silence it with a courtroom. The irony that history delivers here is sharp enough to cut yourself on. The civilization that placed Oscar Wilde in the dock, that built the entire apparatus of diagnosis and criminalization and pathology around same-sex love, that civilization presented itself as the inheritor of Greece and Rome, as the pinnacle of classical tradition. It taught its school children Latin and Greek. It named its public buildings after Roman emperors. It quoted Plato at dinner parties. And it apparently never noticed, or chose not to notice, that Plato's dinner party had been, in the most literal and documented sense, a celebration of exactly what Victorian England was putting people in prison for. The myth required a very selective reading of the classics. It required looking at the statue of Antinous in the museum and not asking why it existed. It required reading the symposium and skipping the inconvenient speeches. It required, above all, the confident assumption that the past must have agreed with the present because the alternative was too destabilizing to consider. History does not agree with the myth. History has never agreed with the myth. The myth was built precisely because history disagreed. Oscar Wilde was released from prison in 1897. He was broken, financially, physically, socially. He died in Paris in 1900, at 46 in a cheap hotel room, under an assumed name. He had written, while in prison, a long letter to the man whose father had engineered his prosecution, a letter later published as De Profundis, in which he reflected on suffering, on love, and on what his life had meant. It is one of the most extraordinary documents in English literature. In it, he does not recant. He does not accept the framework his prosecutors had built. He insists, even from within the wreckage, on the value and legitimacy of what he had loved and how he had lived. He was, in other words, a man who had been crushed by a myth dressed up as history, as nature, as God's own design, and who refused, even at the cost of everything, to pretend the myth was true. The historians who have spent the last half-century excavating this record, Dover, Boswell, David Halperin, Bernadette Bruton, Will Roscoe, and dozens of others, have done something important, not just for the communities whose history was suppressed, but for anyone who cares about the difference between what we have always believed and what the evidence actually shows. They have demonstrated, archive by archive, text by text, stone carving by stone carving, that the history of human sexuality is incomparably richer, stranger, and more varied than the myth of eternal condemnation allows. That the story we were taught was not history. It was advocacy dressed in history's clothing. If that makes you want to pull on another thread, to ask, for instance, how the myth of natural gender roles was similarly constructed, similarly recent, and similarly convenient for those who enforced it, then you are asking exactly the right question. And as it happens, that is a question this channel has already started to answer.